You can't stop the waves of grief, but you can learn to surf. My name is Pablo Das. I am trained as a Buddhist teacher and also as a holistic wellness coach. I work with people around the resolution of trauma and recovery from addiction. My website is causesofwellbeing.com. And today I want to talk about grief. I've just written an article, and so I have my computer here, and I'm gonna just I can't communicate everything that's in the article, but if you want to go to my website, Causes of Wellbeing, you can read the entire article. This was suggested to me by someone on a Facebook comment who wanted to know how to practice with grief. So immediately I thought of this Woody Allen quote, and the quote goes, "To love is to suffer. To avoid suffering, one must not love, but then one suffers from not loving. Therefore, to love is to suffer, not to love is to suffer is to suffer." Now, it seems to me that Mr. Allen has recognized something about the nature of human existence, which is that, difficulty, suffering, loss, grief are all standard issue parts of human experience and therefore somewhat inescapable. In Buddhism, the idea of suffering is of central concern. It's something that we are interested, particularly in how to minimize, but we're interested in, what is it that brings suffering into being, and what is it that alleviates suffering? And to really get to the bottom of what is meant, kind of what the spirit of this investigation is, we have to get more particular about our language. In Buddhism, there's a distinction drawn between the kinds of suffering that are just inherent in life. These are things like aging and sickness and death and, getting what you wanted and losing it, loss, disappointment, having to contend on a daily basis with that which is not preferable to you. There's this kind of acknowledgement that life entails a certain amount of discomfort, that life is a bumpy ride, and that the starting point of, Buddhist practice really is to acknowledge that there is no such thing as a life without a certain degree of pain. And it's important to acknowledge that pain is not equally distributed among human beings. Some of us suffer more than others, but there's this kind of fundamental acknowledgement that suffering is part of the program, and that if you want to experience, an experience of living without suffering ever, then you have to go to some other planet or something, because it's just simply not how it is here. And one of those inescapable standard issue types of suffering in life is grief. Now, grief, of course, is the psychological or emotional response to loss. It's a fairly universal experience. And in a way, it's a function of having developed connection and intimacy and love with some being. You love someone or some being, and you lose them. There's a fairly predictable psychological and emotional response to that. So here's some thoughts about grief, and then the nature of grief, and then maybe how to practice with it. First, and this is really important, I think we don't frequently enough acknowledge that grief is perfectly normal, that grief is healthy, that it's a predictable part of life. I think human beings are so averse to discomfort and pain that when it comes down the line, there's this sort of built-in resistance to it. And it's important to normalize it. When it comes, we accept it. It's almost as if you can arrive at a point in your wisdom about the way that life really is, that it's almost like, oh, okay, so grief is here. I've been expecting you. Welcome. And then we'll have our process with it. It is important, this is the second point, to acknowledge that grief is painful and not to be afraid of that. Buddhism is just one way of thinking about it, but Buddhism is kind of built on this notion that life includes pain, that there's, as I said before, there's not a version of living that doesn't, where we don't experience pain. There's this encouragement to not just acknowledge that pain is there, but to kind of turn towards it and get curious about it, be really willing to I guess cultivate as much presence with the painful parts of life as you do with the pleasant ones. 3, the experience of grieving is different for everybody. There's no predictable process. There's no one right way to do it. The intensity, duration, frequency of the waves of grief as they come will be different for everybody. There may be, for some people, a certain kind of complexity that is different. Grief, at certain points in life might kind of touch into earlier unprocessed griefs. It might touch into traumatic experiences that you've had. The idea here is simply to let go of any notion of the way it ought to be, and to just be willing to meet grief as it unfolds, even if in fact you feel like, shit, I'm not grieving enough. I hear that a lot. There are ways in which people feel like, I'm not feeling the right things, or I just feel numb, or I'm not grieving at all. Just be willing to kind of accept your process as it unfolds, because it is not the same. There's no predictable way to grieve. Same with the timeline. It's different for everyone. Depending on your situation, you may experience what feels like a standard period of grief. You might feel like yours goes on longer than other people that you've seen. In certain situations, grief can be anticipatory. It can kind of come in the lead up to an experience, like if there's an illness and or you have a parent who's aging and you're caretaking or you're taking care of them over sometimes the course of years. There is a process of anticipatory grief that can be every bit as difficult as the actual grief. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there's delayed grief. There's the kind of grief that feels like, oh, I'm grieving something that was a long time ago. Sometimes we're not prepared to grieve, and human beings have this fascinating capacity to sort of put things away. But we don't want to do that. We want to try to have access and allow grief to move through us as it shows up. And then, in Buddhism, there's this kind of idea that everything has a certain set of characteristics. That, grief is not personal. It's a rather impersonal part of the experience of life. It's fairly universal. It's not, it doesn't have anything to say about who you are. Like, you're not any less of a person if you grieve. You're not doing it wrong if you grieve. And it's impermanent. And this is very helpful to realize that the process, the experience of grieving will not stay the same over the course of the grieving period, and it will pretty much resolve. It may not resolve entirely, and in fact, I don't even sort of think we want it to. Now, in terms of practicing with grief, my first thing is to say is to prepare for it. Learn to practice mindfulness, which is simply to turn towards the kind of full range of human experience. There's a saying in another school of Buddhism, don't underestimate how tending to little cares can impact our experience of bearing great adversity in the future. As painful experiences come through your life, turn towards them, be curious about them, sit with them, drop your resistance to them, allow them to move through. Notice what the process of different kinds of painful experiences are. And so when as they say, when the shit really hits the fan, there's practice. You know what it's like to relate to lesser painful experiences. So when the big ones come, they're just kind of more intensive versions of those experiences. Also, in terms of practicing with grief, I would say to be careful to learn to practice compassion instead of aversion. I think human beings, we have this built-in hatred of pain, and it makes sense. It's kind of probably an evolutionary quality, right? We know that when we're comfortable, we're probably safe. When we're in pain, we may be threatened, right? So it makes sense that human beings do everything they can to avoid pain. But if you think really hard about life and you acknowledge that life is fact includes painful experiences, well, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try to avoid them. That's impossible. So, practicing compassion instead of aversion means, first and foremost, acknowledging that pain is part of human experience, that we can't push it away. And pain, or rather compassion, is a practice of not just acknowledging pain, but caring about it, being with it, soothing it if you can, acknowledging that it's a normal part of human experience. Just a willingness to turn towards, to acknowledge and care about pain is compassion. Okay, this is a big one. Watch out for stories. An equally important part of mindfulness practice where grief is concerned is not just to draw your attention into the body and notice the sensations and all of that, but learn to pay attention to the stories that you're making about grief and about pain. I always say, instead of why me, just rest in the why not me. Like, how could you not experience grief? The stories that we conjure are a way of generating extra suffering on top of what is already painful. And that's the kind of suffering that Buddhism is most interested, the way that we self-generate suffering, usually out of resistance to pain. So this comes back to this idea of not, practicing aversion, but rather to practice a kind of acceptance and openness, dropping your resistance and cultivating compassion with it. The same goes with your stories. I started the talk by saying you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. Grief comes in waves. And usually the grief at the beginning can be the most kind of violent waves that come through and with the most frequency. And then what you'll notice over time is that the waves will be a little smaller and they'll be further apart. If you're using the surfing analogy, the sets will be a little more spaced out. And and then like a tsunami will come through, and then you'll kind of continue on this kind of more moderate grief, and then it'll be less and less frequent, and it is impermanent. Over time you will experience that, as I said before, that it doesn't entirely leave you, but as the waves come through, the surfing is the turning towards. It's a willingness to just sort of be present to it. Notice how it manifests in the body, does its dance, and then passes away, right? This kind of impermanent arising and passing of the waves of grief. That's the dance, and that's the surfing of grief. And two more things. One, sometimes it's appropriate to just shut it down. Sometimes it gets overwhelming. Sometimes we just need to check out and eat ice cream and watch TV. One of the great, I don't know if it's literature, but one of the great books of my life is a book called Tuesdays with Morrie, which was about a man who was in a dying process, and he was grieving the loss of his own life. And he talked about how he would set aside time to sort of contain the grief, where he would say, I give it an hour in the morning to cry and feel sorry and to allow those stories and, to feel bad for myself and all of that. And then at the end of the hour, he would get up and get on with life, living the life that he had. I've always loved that idea, this idea of almost creating space and then saying enough, right? So there are appropriate ways to sort of shut it down so that we can get on with living and tending to what we have to tend to, and so that it doesn't completely overwhelm us. But it is in the acceptance and the turning towards it and the kind of containment, the contained space in which we allow ourselves to relate to it, that allows us then to shut it down later. And then here's the final piece, of course, is don't do it alone. Grief is better when we allow other people to help us carry it. It's not that they can feel it for us. In fact, most people can't really do anything for us except be present and sometimes offer a little bit of wisdom, and to care. And that is more than enough. It is your job to ask for help, to not do it alone. So those are some of my ideas about grief. I appreciate the suggestion. In the comments, if you... Social media, I'm doing the thing. In the comments, if you have some topics or themes that you'd like to see me cover, make some suggestions. I take them seriously. And finally, if you're interested in one-on-one support, you can reach out to me on my website, which is causesofwellbeing.com. There's a coaching tab. You can send me a quick email and I'll respond and see if I'm the appropriate person to support you. Finally, if you would, do all the things, like and comment and subscribe and all these things that I don't really want to do, but I do because it's the time of our lives that we have to do this kind of thing. Thanks for watching. I hope this is useful to you. I'll see you again.